Hello there and welcome to the assessment cluster. So this is the learning module number 1 in the assessment cluster series. So up till now, hopefully you have watched the language literacy and numeracy cluster, you've watched the design cluster 1, 2, 3, and the delivery cluster 1, 2, 3, and now we are heading into the assessment cluster. And I hope that you've watched those things in that order, because that's essentially the order that you're going to go through the course and the different projects in. So if you can ideally stick to that order, that would be fantastic. Now, this is Success Training Academy, TAE40116 Assessment Cluster Learning Module. So as always, there's going to be 3 modules in this series, and the assessment cluster, I think, is probably one of the most in-depth, insightful and empowering clusters to certainly understand and get your head around, because ultimately assessment is one of the fundamental things that we need to understand if we are working as an RTO. Yes, delivery and training skills are very, very, very important. However, at the end of the day, the purpose of training is to actually make sure that someone has the skills and knowledge so that eventually they can be assessed and they can be granted their qualification. So it's really important that we understand how assessment works, how to do it effectively, and the key components to it. Also, a lot of different aspects of assessment are overlaying onto compliance, and compliance is definitely another area that you do need to slowly get your head around if you are working as an RTO. All right, so definitely have a notepad available, have an open mind, have a sense of anticipation about what we're going to go through. The assessment cluster, I will say up front, is probably a lot more in depth than maybe the other clusters that we've gone through up till now. However, that's just the nature of the beast, and in the actual TAE, you are covering 4 units in the assessment cluster, as opposed to the other units where maybe we're just covering 2 or 3 units, okay? So let's get straight into it. And as always, have a notepad available. Be prepared to do the activities as we go through them, and have a do not disturb sign on your desk, okay? As I said, the assessment cluster is one that you may require a little bit more concentration for, and one that you would definitely want to watch a couple of times if you do feel that you need to, all right? So, another thing I will mention is that in the area of assessment, different RTOs approach it slightly differently. However, we are going to go through the fundamentals and the mindset around creating assessments, executing assessments, reviewing assessments, and making sure that you are meeting the requirements for the unit of competency. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, assessment. The definition of assessment, okay? So basically assessment is the process of collecting evidence and making judgments on whether competency has been achieved by students or by candidates to confirm that an individual can perform to the standard required in the workplace as specified in a training package or VET accredited course. Okay. The user's guide to the standards for a registered training organisation provides us with that definition. Okay, and you'll be able to find that definition on page 108 of the standards. Okay, so now let's look at competency. Well, as we've already talked about in the design cluster and the delivery cluster, competency is basically the consistent application of knowledge and skill to the standard of performance required in the workplace. It embodies the ability to transfer and apply skills and knowledge to new situations and environments. Okay, so as I've mentioned, in the vet sector, it's all about training people up to be ready for the workplace, and that's what we do. All right, we're trying to skill them up so that they have the knowledge and the skills to be able to execute whatever task it may be required within the workplace and industry standard. Okay, so essentially, when we're assessing, we are making sure that they have developed those skills and they can readily apply those skills to the job that they're going into or that they're currently in and they need to be qualified for. Okay, so why do we assess? As I just said, we are assessing to make sure that they are ready. Okay, so when we're looking at someone's performance, whether it's an observation that we're performing on them or we're getting them to fill out a written test or whatever it might be, at the end of it, when we are grading or assessing their performance, we're just asking ourselves, is the candidate ready for the future workplace? That's it. If they're ready, then we can say that they are competent. If they're not ready, then we can say that they are not yet competent. All right, we really like to keep that in mind because otherwise, things can get a little bit hazy and vague and ambiguous, and sometimes students can appeal a decision or whatever it might be. But it comes down to the fact of, is the student ready or not ready for the workplace? That's all it is. Okay, so now, as part of assessment in the vet sector, there's two possible streams. There's training and assessment, or there's RPL stream. Okay, now there's credit transfer and recognition of current competency. There's a couple others, but for now, all I want you to be aware of is the streams of training and assessment and RPL. So training assessment is basically when somebody enrolls in a course and they are learning the skills and knowledge for the very first time, and at the end of the training, they are being assessed. Okay. RPL, on the other hand, is when a student, they themselves, have deemed themselves to have the skills and knowledge already, and they may have been performing the role for the last 2 years, and they already possess the skills and knowledge and can prove that via evidence. All right, they can prove it via evidence. So ultimately, RPL is about the recognition of skills and knowledge via evidence. Okay, there is no training involved at all, and because essentially the candidate is saying, I don't need to be trained, I can already do what's required within the units of competency, and I've got enough proof to substantiate my claim. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The training assessment is one stream, RPL is another stream, and the difference between the two is that RPL, essentially the candidate is declaring that they don't need to be trained and they only need to be assessed, and the assessment method would be through providing evidence and also being observed for the sake of the skills as well. All right. So, ways to assess in the vet sector. There's a number of different ways that we could assess somebody. We could do it through written tests, essays, multiple choice, verbal Q&A, so verbal interviews, practical tests, simulated tasks, games, portfolios of evidence, projects, presentations, observations in the workplace, and role plays. Okay. So the method of assessment that we choose is going to come back to what we're actually assessing. And depending on what the unit requires us to see the student do or test the student's knowledge on, we're going to pick the most appropriate way to assess the student. However, the method of assessment is often left up to the assessment creator themselves. And you may find that if you go to different RTOs, you may study the same unit, but they may choose to assess it in different ways. And that's perfectly fine, as long as we meet the unit requirements, okay? So now I need to introduce you to a concept called the dimensions of competency. And this is essentially 4 aspects of ability, or 4 aspects that 4 indicators that would tell us that yes, this person can absolutely do the task. Okay, so when I think about ability or competency, there's 4 components to that. Okay, so I'm just thinking of different ways that you can use the word aspect, component, elements, whatever it might be. But just think, okay, competency, what would make up somebody's ability to do something? And you could put this into any context at all, but if I said somebody is competent in a task, what does that actually mean? Well, let's break that down into 4 areas. So we've got task skills. So basically that means that they can do the thing, okay? They can do it, okay? The task management skills is that they can do it while doing something else. So it's kind of like multitasking, okay? They can do it, they can multitask on it. Job role environment skills is that they can do it in multiple environments, okay? And they could do the task in different workplaces. Contingency management skills is when they can do it, but they can also know what to do if something goes wrong, Okay, so task skills. Let's run an example and let's talk about driving a forklift. Okay, so they can drive a forklift. That would be the task skill. Okay, task management skill would be that they can drive the forklift and they can have a load on the forklift, and potentially they could drive it and they could avoid different, let's say, what would be the word? They could drive it around different objects in the area, okay? And maybe they could have to manage a situation where they have to pick up different loads, okay? Now, job role environment skills would be the fact that they could drive the forklift in different types of warehouses, and they could maybe even drive different forklift types, okay? Contingency management skills, they would know what to do if the load fell off the forklift, okay? That's a bit of a crude example. However, we're just trying to think of what could go wrong and would they be able to manage it if something went wrong, okay? Another example could be, let's say that they're in an office environment, okay? So task skill could be, let's say, making a photocopy, okay? Task management skill could be making a photocopy and maybe scanning a document and maybe doing that while answering the telephone. Okay, it's a crazy idea, but let's go with it. Job role, environment skill, maybe they could do that with various types of photocopiers. Contingency management skill, they know what to do if there's a paper jam. Okay, so hopefully that has made sense to you and you can see how all of these things interlink and would, when put together, demonstrate that somebody can definitely do the task. Okay, now common assessor mistakes. Let's talk about it straight up, okay? Because assessors do make mistakes, but some mistakes are more severe than others, and they can have a serious compliance impact, okay? And one of the biggest things that we need to remember as assessors is that ultimately it is the area of assessing that is the most significant and impactful when it comes to an audit, okay? So if assessments are not being done properly, that is one huge area that is definitely looked at when it comes to an RTO being audited, okay? So we have to make sure that when we're assessing, we are assessing the right way and we are making as little mistakes as possible as assessors, okay? So common mistakes. All right, so the first one could be making biased decisions. All right, so this hopefully doesn't happen too often. However, you want to make sure that your students never perceive you as the assessor making those biased decisions, and you want to make sure that you are making fair and impartial decisions on everything that you see. Okay. Being disorganized, definitely a big mistake. You want to make sure that you are prepared for every assessment that you need to conduct and that you have the equipment available and you know who you're assessing, when you're assessing them, how you're assessing them, all those different things. All right. Being late for assessments, please, please, please don't do that. Okay. You never want to keep students waiting. Not having the right equipment available or the right equipment at all, not a good idea. You want to make sure that you are fully prepared and you know how to use the equipment. Not preparing students for their tasks properly. When you are about to conduct an assessment, you need to make sure that these students are aware of what they're about to go through, how to give you a good quality answer, what is the levels of expected performance, things like that. All right, forgetting to sign documents is a big one for assessors because often there's just so many different things to do when you're assessing that people simply just forget to sign documents at the end of the day. It could be an observation checklist, it could be anything at all. And make sure you sign everything that you need to sign. Unprofessional, insufficient feedback. What we mean by this is after a student's completed an assessment task, make sure that you do provide good quality feedback. You tell them what they've done, how well they've done, i.e. did they get satisfactory or not yet satisfactory, and If they got satisfactory, why did they do well? All right, what specifically really stood out to you as assessor? And if they got not yet satisfactory, what specifically was missing? And we'll talk about that in this webinar, all right? If not the next webinar or the webinar after that. Rushing students, definitely a bad idea. You never want to rush them. Unless there is a time constraint and they need to meet the time constraint specifically, okay? Another one is over prompting students. If you ever are doing a practical task with a student and a student's struggling a little bit, you need to be careful that you're not prompting too much because that could be giving away the answers. Okay, so top 10 qualities of a great assessor, what would that look like? Well, I would say that we're going to head into a bit of a model here for a second. However, before we go into that model, top 10 qualities, I would say that an assessor is fair, they're organized, they're punctual, they are a great communicator, they hold students accountable, and they treat students fairly. What else? They are prompt in marking students. They make sure that a student feels comfortable as they are doing the assessment. They're great at building rapport, but they don't let rapport transform from professional rapport to I guess personal rapport. It's very important that when you're assessing students that you do have a good adequate I guess psychological distance with the students so they do feel like they are truly being assessed and tested. Another quality is great time management. You want to make sure that you are managing your time very well in assessments. Okay, I think that's about it, all that I can think of right now. However, there are definitely lots of great important qualities for an assessor to have. Now, I want to share a model with you, and this is called the RIG model. All right, and this was developed after having watched probably hundreds of assessors as they assess their students, but also the fact that I have often watched two exact same assessors assess a student and come back with completely different results. And I just want to share the first reason that that may happen. Okay, so the first thing we need to be very aware of is R. All right, now whenever we're starting to assess a student, first thing that we need to do is remove all assumptions. Now, what I mean by this is even if you have seen a student do the task multiple times perfectly in training, you must remember that when you are assessing a student, you must remove all assumptions and remove all previous conceived ideas about the student. And you must only assess on what you see in front of you in that moment. So what happens in training stays in training, and it can never leak over to assessment. Okay, just because you've seen the student do it previously and perfectly, you can't allow that to let's say impact your judgment at all. All right, so it's really important that you remove all assumptions. Now, the next part is I. Now, I stands for investigate, and investigate fully. What I sometimes see happen with assessors is that they will ask a couple of questions and without fully investigating, they will already make a snap judgment. Okay, so it's really important that if you have any doubts at all about a student's answer, or if you have any doubts about maybe RPL evidence that a student has provided, you ask for more evidence. Or if they have done a task but you are not 100% confident that they could actually do the task in the real world, you get them to do it again. All right, so investigate fully to the point where you are 100% confident that they can absolutely do it. Okay, now G stands for give quality feedback. Now, what I mean by that is great feedback always includes the magic word of because. So, great job on your presentation because you included all the required content and you made great eye contact with all of your audience and engaged everybody. Well done. All right, that is good quality feedback. Okay, you must include the reasons for your judgment. All right, so just to recap, we got remove assumptions, got investigate fully, and give quality feedback. And if you are consistently doing these things, then you are probably performing at a very high level as an assessor. Okay, so keep that in mind whenever you are assessing or you're training up other assessors for sure. Okay, now assessor ethics. One of the things that you'll come to understand is that when you're an assessor, you will have multiple competing, interests, and the students will want one thing, the compliance department will want one thing, the auditors will want one thing, you as an assessor will want something, okay? And sometimes it's really tricky to balance all of those needs, all right? But as an assessor, we must be able to stand on our judgment and be 100% confident that whatever we're saying, we can justify. And this is where good quality assessment tools or assessment instruments or paperwork comes into play. Okay, so who are the stakeholders in assessment? Well, as you can see on the slide there, we've got the student. They are definitely a stakeholder because they're impacted by assessment. Okay, there's a designer. Now, when I say designer, I mean the person that ultimately created the assessment. Okay, and it's certainly a skill set in itself to be able to create good quality assessments. All right. Now we've got the auditor. Now the auditor is a stakeholder because they're going to look at the assessments. They're going to look at were they designed professionally? Was everything from the unit covered or not? And is it meeting the standards for the unit? Is it meeting the standards for the training package? Are the assessors guides clear enough for everybody to make a good quality decision? All those different things. Okay. Now, again, the assessor is a stakeholder because they are impacted by the assessment decisions as well. Okay. Now, all of these stakeholders want something slightly different. All right. And it's really important that you understand that there can be blind spots, and some of the biggest misconceptions and misunderstandings, miscommunications can happen because people just don't understand what the other party wants. Okay, so let's get into it. Student, what do they want? Well, ultimately, the student wants an assessment that is very relatable and is appropriate to the level and, if possible, provides reasonable adjustment if that student has any challenges or specific needs. Okay, so I'll say it again. The student really wants something that's really relatable, something that's appropriate to the level, and something that provides reasonable adjustment. Okay, now what does the assessor want? Well, the assessor wants clear guidance on how to assess and what a good quality answer is. But what they also want is ease of use, okay? Because the assessor doesn't want to have to sign thousands of things. They don't want to be looking at multiple pages. They just want to make sure that it's something that's easy and flows nicely for them to use, okay? What does the auditor want? Well, the auditor wants to make sure, again, the benchmark answers are very clear and there's a very clear markers guide. But they also want to make sure that the assessment meets what's called the principles of assessment and the answers meet the rules of evidence. Okay, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later on. Designer, what do they want? They want to make sure that it is very compliant and everything from the unit is being covered. Now, where things go slightly wrong or skew-if or people get upset is because sometimes the student doesn't understand the unit requirements, and sometimes the student may look at some of the questions and go, this is complicated, I don't understand why this question's worded this way. However, the designer has worded it that way because it needs to be compliant. Okay. Now the assessor sometimes get frustrated with the designer and the auditor because again, they think, oh, the question, it's a little bit confusing, complicated. Sometimes they don't remember that it's based on the unit of competency. Okay, and sometimes the designer and the auditor get frustrated with the student and assessor because they don't provide good quality evidence, good quality assessment judgments, things like that. All right, so everybody's got something slightly different that they want to achieve from the assessment process. Okay, but ultimately we are assessing if the student has the skills and knowledge that they have been trained on through their course. Okay, so what are we actually assessing? What are we assessing from the unit of competency? Okay, well, we are assessing what's called performance evidence, knowledge evidence, and it's done in the assessment conditions. Okay, so let's look at an example for that. Okay, let's see if I can pull it up. Okay, so we have this unit here, organized meetings, and I've shown you this example a few times, this unit itself. However, as I say, it's quite a relatable unit of competency. All right, so as I said, it's called organized meetings. Okay, it comes from the business services training package, and it's generally around a Cert 3, Cert 4 level that's taught in. Okay, so in terms of assessment, the first thing that we want to look at is what's called the assessment conditions. Okay, so we want to check this out, and we also want to check it out in conjunction with performance evidence. Okay, so assessment must be conducted in a safe environment where evidence gathered demonstrates consistent performance of typical activity experience in the general administration field of work and include access to office equipment and resources. Okay, cool. All right, cool. We got that. Next thing we want to do is we want to check out the performance evidence, because this is going to tell us exactly what we need to see the student do to prove that they are competent for this unit. Okay, so if we are assessing this unit, we would look to see, all right, the candidate needs to organize a meeting and advise participants accordingly. Okay, got it. They need to prepare and distribute all documentation required for the meeting. Okay, they need to take meeting notes which accurately reflect what was discussed during the meeting. They need to produce minutes based on own notes, providing an accurate account of the meeting. And they need to circulate copies of meeting minutes within predetermined timeframes. So if we were looking to assess this unit, as you can imagine, reading through that, it pretty much tells us that we would need to create a project for the candidate to do, or we would create an observation checklist for the candidate to do, so we would watch them do each of these tasks, okay? And we would probably have a written test in which we would test them on this knowledge, okay? So we would create an observation checklist or a project, and as part of the project, they would need to organize a meeting and send out emails. They would need to prepare and distribute all the agenda meetings. All right, they need to take meeting notes, take meeting notes which accurately reflect what was discussed. So they would need to take minutes from the meeting, and they would need to send that out, and we need to have proof of that. Okay. Now, what we want to make sure is within the project, we are covering all of these things as well. Now, what we would want to do is look at each of the items, and as we read it, we want to come up with some idea of how we would assess it. Okay, so 1.1 there, it says identify the type of meeting being organized and its purpose. So probably what we could do is we could cover that off. We could cover that off in probably inside the project, okay? And we can cover it off in maybe a verbal question or a written test as well, okay? And identify and comply with any legal or ethical requirements. We'd probably put that as part of the project. Identify requirements of the meeting as participants. Probably put that as part of the project, and that's going to fall part of the agenda that we get students to make. Make meeting arrangements. All right, cool. Well, it's probably going to be we can assess that via a written test and part of the project. Advise participants of meeting detail, again, part of the project and maybe a written test. Prepare notice of meeting, agenda, make meeting papers in accordance with meeting requirements. Again, we can do that through the project and a written test. Check documentation for accuracy and correct any errors. Well, we could make that a sub-task in the project for sure. Okay, so what you can do is go through each of these items and decide, would you assess that via the project or just written test? Okay, then when you come down here and you've got the knowledge evidence, probably most of the knowledge evidence will be covered off by a written test. All right, how do we do that? Well, come here and check out the knowledge evidence. We could make questions on the knowledge evidence items. So we could make a question such as, what would be some culturally appropriate communication techniques? Or what are 2 culturally inappropriate things that we should never do within a meeting? Okay. Next, we've got identify the relevant formats for agendas and meetings. We could say, what are 3 things that you would that you would include in a meeting agenda? Or what else have we got? What would you include in the meeting minutes? Okay, and also as part of the project, certainly they're going to be required to create a meeting agenda and record the meeting minutes, of course. Okay, it says list the key provisions of relevant legislation. We could create a question about that and say, what are 3 pieces of legislation that would apply to running meetings? Okay. And another one could be, let's see, outline the organizing procedures relevant to the task. All right, so it could be if you're running a meeting within your organization, what are 6 procedures that you must follow specific to your team or your company? Okay, so you can get really creative with the questions that we ask around here, but knowledge evidence is essentially the knowledge that they would need in order to be able to do the task of organizing a meeting. Okay, so hopefully that's made sense to you. Let me just recap. So we read through the assessment conditions, then we're going to read through the performance evidence and check out what we need to see them do. Okay, and this is going to give us some indication as to what method of assessment would be really good. Okay, then we're going to come up here, read through the performance criteria, and of course we need to assess them doing these things as well. Okay, so these performance criteria, for example, 1.1 could be covered off by the project, 1.2 could be covered off by a written test. Okay, and this process, what we're going through right now, is the first stages of what's called mapping. Okay, we're going to go through mapping in a lot more detail later on. Okay, but that is just basically the first steps that we go through when we are looking to build our assessments. All right, so let's head back to our slides. Okay, cool. So now let me show you an example of what mapping looks like. So just as I was describing, what you can then do is maybe 1.1, you thought that was covered off in an observation checklist, item number 1. Okay, now 1.2, that could be covered off by a written test, and that's covered off by written question number 1. Okay, 1.3, that's covered off by question 3. 2.1, question 5, all right, and 2.2, item 2 on the checklist. 2.3, task 1 in the project, and task 2, task 3, task 4. Now, there is no specific or stipulated amount of ways that you must assess something, okay? There used to be a rumor or a standard operating procedure that you had to assess an item 3 ways, but that's not necessarily the case these days, and there's a little bit more flexibility with it. But as long as you are thoroughly convinced that the item is being assessed completely, then that's okay. All right, so another aspect of mapping, so let's extend it out. So we've got the performance criteria here. Now, if we continue the mapping, obviously we've got performance evidence, which is covered by the observations here in this case. Knowledge evidence, well, we've said as part of the written test. All right, and assessment conditions. Okay, so hopefully that's made sense to you. And this is just the first initial stages as we build our assessment. Okay, what you'll often find is that in the beginning stages, somebody will just put a cross against how it's going to be assessed, and then later on they'll come back and actually put in the question number specifically once you've made the assessment. Okay, so Now, 12 fundamental steps to assessment. Okay, so first thing we want to do is read the performance evidence or read the assessment conditions. You can pretty much do it in either order. Okay. Number 3, you want to read the knowledge evidence and you want to see what specific knowledge the students must have in order to be able to do the task, obviously. All right. Now, number 4, you want to map the assessment, as I've just shown you. Okay. Now, number 5, you want to make an assessment plan. Okay, so a plan is basically a templated document that you fill out that's going to ask you questions such as, what is the unit, who are the learners, who's going to be the assessor, what are the assessment methods you're going to use, what equipment will be required for the assessment, what assessment individual instruments will be required, and things like that. And if you want to see a copy of an assessment plan, there is one in your assessment workbook as well. All right, but basically it's just an overarching plan that lays out how assessment will take place. Okay. Now, number 6, make assessment instruments and contextualize them where possible. What we mean by this is you would make the observation checklist, or you would make the written test, or you would make the project, or you would make the verbal interview, or you would make the third-party report. Okay, and then where it says contextualize, it means make the questions as specific to that workplace and that group of learners as possible. Okay. Number 7 is trial the assessment on other assessors or trial students. Okay, so you never want to use a brand new assessment test or instrument or tool on students for the very first time, because you want to make sure that you trial it and then get feedback, because maybe the questions don't work at all. All right, maybe the observation tasks that you're getting your students to do are way beyond their capabilities. Okay, so as much as possible, you want to trial the assessment. Number 8, you want to modify your instruments based on the feedback. Number 9, you conduct your assessments on real-life candidates. Number 10, you want to write an assessment report on a candidate's performance. Okay, so this is just the steps you go through in the entire assessment process. Number 11, if satisfactory in all areas, they are competent. If not yet satisfactory, or if they are not yet competent in any area, then they must be reassessed. Okay. Number 12, you need to validate assessment instruments with peers or external consultants. And we'll talk more about validation at another time. However, just think about validation as quality assurance for your assessments. Okay. And now, your role and responsibilities in assessment. Okay, so know your role. Very, very, very important. So the duties of an assessor in preparing for assessment: know who your candidates are, for sure. Okay, contextualize your assessments to your audience. Okay, make sure the questions are really specific and they're easier to relate to. Provide reasonable adjustment where you can and how you can. Know your assessment environment, for sure. What that means is just know the conditions under which you're going to be assessing students. Prepare all resources, checklists, etc., equipment, whatever it might be. Keep the assessment process safe. Write assessment feedback forms for your students and be involved in validations. Okay, that could be part of your role as an assessor. Okay, so key things to remember in all assessments: students need to be comfortable in order to perform at their best. Okay, you don't want to put them under too much pressure all of the time, because they could freak out and get nervous and anxious and all of that. There are certainly some scenarios where you would need to ramp up the pressure a little bit. However, just keep in mind that there is a correlation between comfort and performance. Okay? Set very clear expectations and do not prompt your learners during the task. Very, very important, because sometimes you may have some assessors that prompt more than others, and if that happens, then you're going to find, obviously, there's going to be inconsistency across assessors. Okay, so your candidates, keep the candidate at the center of everything you do as an assessor. Okay, it's very, very important that you think about who you're assessing and what's going on. All right, so reasonable adjustment. We've talked about this a little bit, but basically, as an RTO, you have obligations to actually provide fair and equal assessment against all students. All right, so there's obligations under the standards for RTOs 2015 that access and equity means policies and approaches aimed at ensuring that VETS is responsible or is responsive to the individual needs of clients whose age, gender, cultural or ethnic background, disability, sexuality, language skills, literacy and numeracy level, unemployment, imprisonment or remote location may present a barrier to access, participation, and the achievement of suitable outcomes. Okay, so we, as an RTO, or every RTO, has an obligation to provide reasonable adjustment. Okay, so reasonable adjustment is essentially making shifts, modifications, changes to how a student is being assessed so that they have equal opportunity. So that could mean making adjustments to equipment. Okay, making adjustments to the height of a desk, or if somebody's got back issues and maybe they've got a stand-up desk, or if they're in a wheelchair, then making sure that the wheelchair can fit under the desk and all of that. Okay, access to classroom. You certainly want to make sure that there's a ramp to get into the classroom. Okay, adjustments to learning materials. Maybe you put the learning materials in Braille if somebody can't read or they've got visual impairment. Maybe if they can't read, you turn it into an audio file that somebody can play and they can listen to it. Okay, adjustments to assessment methods. Maybe if a student can't write, maybe they're provided with a scribe who will write for them, or maybe the assessment is done verbally as opposed to written form. Okay, so what could you do? So a candidate has visual challenges. What could you do? Well, obviously, things could be read out to them, things could be put in Braille or that. Hearing challenges. If somebody has hearing challenges, then a sign language interpreter could be brought in, okay? Subtitles on videos, those kind of things, all right? Can't travel to be assessed? Well, maybe they could be assessed via video and a video link up, okay? Can't concentrate for long periods of time. Well, maybe they're given a longer period to be assessed on, okay? Maybe they can have multiple breaks, okay? Candidate has dyslexia. Again, maybe you would get somebody else to write for them, or maybe you would turn a written test into a verbal test, all right? So these are all the different things that you can do. However, you need to make sure that you don't ever jeopardize the assessment conditions of the unit of competency. And what we mean by that is you don't want to get them to do a task or give too much allowance when technically the unit requires them to do it in a particular way. You can't just allow them to do it in another way because they've got a disability, if that makes sense. Okay. So we need to make sure, for example, in the unit it says candidate must do CPR on the ground for 2 minutes. Okay, so you can't say to a student who's got a back issue who can't get on the ground, oh, don't worry, you can do the CPR on a table. That's not good enough. All right, you have to respect the boundary conditions of the unit of competency, and normally any reasonable adjustment is actually approved by an academic manager. All right, so that's best practice. Okay, reasonable adjustment, you must keep it reasonable and keep it reasonable within what would be expected in the workplace and within industry. Okay, now contextualization is about making it very, very relevant for the learners. All right, so an example of that would be maybe you have a question such as tell me types of meetings you have at work. Well, a contextualized version of that would be within your job role as a salesperson, tell me 3 meetings you might have at your workplace. Okay, so you can, excuse the typo there, but you can see how this has made it a lot more specific and it's made very relatable for the audience and for the student that's going through it. Okay, and you want to make sure that when you're creating your assessments, you use terminology, you use examples that the audiences are familiar with. So if you are teaching first aid to paramedics, then obviously the questions are going to relate to pre-hospital care. If you were talking about let's see, financial transactions for hairdressers, then obviously it's going to have examples that are specific to hairdressers taking money, dealing with money. Okay, so contextualization is all about making examples relevant for the audience. And certainly we use a lot of contextualization in training as well, but we need to make sure that we bring it into our assessment so that students can understand and quickly get, yeah, cool, I understand that question. I know exactly what I'm meant to answer. So what you need to know about your candidates before you commence, all right? You need to know their LLN levels, for sure. You need to know if they have any special needs. You need to know if they have any, if there's any prerequisites, and have they been completed or not. So for example, if somebody's looking to do the diploma of WHS, well, one of the prerequisites is a Cert 4 in WHS, all right? Availability for assessment. Can the students come in on the weekends after the work? You know, when is going to be a time that they can come in and do their assessments, and when is going to be the best time for you as the assessor as well. Also, when is the equipment going to be available? Because sometimes there is restrictions on equipment that you may need. Okay. So, good test. How do we know if it's a good test? Well, it will meet the 4 criteria. The 4 criteria are valid, flexible, reliable, and fair. I'll say it again. Valid, flexible, reliable, and fair. Valid, flexible, reliable, and fair. Okay, valid, flexible, reliable, and fair. And I recommend that you take a photograph of this slide for sure. Okay, now valid basically means that it matches up to the unit. So in the unit, if it talks about the assessment must be done outdoors, and in the assessment it says outdoors, fantastic. But in the unit it says outdoors, but in the unit it says students can do it indoors. Well, that would mean that the assessment is not valid. Flexible. When we say that the assessment is flexible, well, we are saying that basically it caters for individual learner needs, okay? And what we mean by that is that, for example, it can be done via RPL. It can be done via distance, okay? So there's a little bit of flexibility there. Reliable means that all assessors get similar judgments and make similar judgments, and all candidates interpret the question in the same way. Fair. Fair relates to reasonable adjustment, and there is allowance for reasonable adjustment in how the assessment is taking place. Okay, so valid, it matches the unit. Flexible, students can do it via RPL or distance, and there's enough contextualization. Reliable, all assessors use it the same way and get similar judgments. Okay, fair, it allows for reasonable adjustment. So make sure that you've written that down as I've said it, and you may need to rewind it. However, it's critically important that you understand the differences between each of these. Okay. Now, rules of evidence. Is it a good answer? Now, these are the criteria that's going to tell you when you're assessing someone if they have given you a good quality answer or not. Okay. So, rules of evidence basically are: how do you know if the answer is correct or not? And there's 4 criteria that an answer must meet. And those criteria are valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. Okay, so valid, authentic, current, and sufficient. And what that means basically is that valid means that the answer is correct. So if I asked you who's the President of America, and at this moment, at the time of recording this webinar, it is Donald Trump. So if you said the answer is Donald Trump, then your answer would be valid. Okay. If you said the President of America is Tom Cruise, well, your answer would not be valid. Okay. Authentic. Well, authentic means that we can prove that it's the candidate's own work and there's no ounce of plagiarism in there at all. Current. Current basically means that the answer is up to date. Okay. So sufficient means that the answer is long enough. All right, there's enough detail in the answer. Okay, so if you are marking a student's answer You need to be 100% sure that the answer is correct, it's their own work, it's up to date, and there is enough detail. So for example, if the question says in 200 words answer the following, and if they only put in 10 words, then obviously it's not sufficient, okay? So hopefully you've understood the rules of evidence. We're going to come back to them multiple times in the learning modules that we're going to go through. But at this stage, I just need to understand that there are 4 criteria, and the answer must be correct, proven to be the candidate's own work, up to date, and sufficient. Okay, so that is essentially the first introduction to the assessment cluster, and it is a cluster that we're going to dive deep on, and we're certainly going to go in next cluster into how you actually make those assessments. And then the third cluster is going to talk about the policies, the procedures, and the instructions that you would put as part of the assessment. Okay, so hope you've enjoyed this cluster. Hope you got a lot from it, and thank you for your time, energy, and focus. And if you have any questions at all, make sure that you've joined the TAE graduate group and you start to ask those questions. Don't forget about the Advanced Trainer Bootcamp if you want to take your delivery skills to the next level. But thank you so much, and we will see you on the next one. Bye for now.